might be helpful to the House if I say that there is no time limit at this stage on backbench speeches, but an informal limit involving a certain self-denying ordinance might help. An informal limit of 10 minutes per backbench member seems reasonable and well within the capacities of a Kentish knight. Sir Julian Brazier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The House must be getting very bored with being reminded, although I was extremely grateful for the much undeserved honour. I welcome this bill. I'm a strong supporter of the NCS. I had the opportunity to visit some of the 130 constituents who did their National Citizen Service last year, and I was very impressed with the youngsters I met. They had clearly enjoyed the earlier adventure training phase and were producing some really interesting ideas for working for local charities. This combination of challenging activity and a sense of service are something which I believe will be a very important part of our last Prime Minister's legacy, and I was really delighted to see that David Cameron has agreed to be chairman of the patrons. I'm going to focus what I'm going to say now on the first bit of the programme, the Adventure Training Programme, because while I strongly support what's being delivered there and the very strong team headed by Michael Linus and indeed his chairman, Mr Green, who I had the opportunity to meet just before this, I am concerned that there are some wider trends out there which lie outside the strict confines of this bill, but knowing how tolerant you are, Mr Speaker, as it's highly relevant to the supply chain for National Citizen Service, I'd like to just touch on them. Adventure training, which every NCS student does for at least a week and in some cases 2 weeks, usually at the beginning of the programme, develops teamwork, it develops confidence, it involves pushing the bounds and learning how to manage risk in a positive and a constructive manner. It's very, very important. It's also increasingly rare. As far back as 12 years ago, the then Education Select Committee pointed out that we, the country which produced the team that cracked Everest, had actually slipped down the league and were arguably below average around the world in our capacity for adventure training. 5 years ago, the English Outdoor Council produced a list of residential centres that deliver, in their view, good quality adventure training. Of those 180 centres, 30 have since closed. Equally disturbing, a number of others have been taken over by providers who are providing a good commercial offer in the sense that their insurance premiums are low because their risks are extremely low, but in the words of one expert in the field, typically deliver every meal indoors for the children. In other words, these so-called adventure opportunities involve nothing lasting for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. Now, the NCS is firmly aimed at the right end of the market. All of the experiences of all the NCS students I've met have been extremely good ones, drawn from good parts of the sector. But we have to be clear, this element is still shrinking now. I believe that the reasons for it are twofold. One is the litigious culture we're in, and the second is the worry about prosecution. 2 surveys done, one in 2003 by the CCPR and one by the Scouts in 2006, revealed the blame culture as the #1 concern among adult volunteers. It's also, in the era when you can face a corporate manslaughter charge, a very serious concern for those local authorities and others who run these providers. I would like to suggest that we made some progress in terms of rolling back the litigious culture. After an all-party effort behind a private members' bill, which I was privileged to do, the Labour government introduced a small measure called the Compensation Act, with really only one substantial clause in it, which reminded the courts that if they make an award against an organisation, they need to take account of the damage potentially to the wider interest in that activity. It was supported on all sides of the House, although opposed by a number of highly articulate lawyers on both sides of the House in both chambers, interestingly. The threat of prosecution remains a very serious threat. There's been a certain amount of sort of banter out there in the media about alleged stories alleging various phony regulations. And the HSE, whose new chairman I strongly welcome, has debunked lots of myths. But the problem whenever I discuss people providing adventure training is never with regulation. Nobody has ever, in a serious adventure training context, once raised a regulation with me as a problem. That is not the issue. The problem is the risk of prosecution if something goes wrong. Now, perhaps the worst case of this was called Bewley Park. 2005, a boy of 14 was drowned in a caving incident in Yorkshire's top adventure training provider. The Health and Safety Executive decided to prosecute the local authority, and the case took more than 5 years to come to court. Finally, in 2010, the local authority were acquitted. They were acquitted, though, because a critical body called the Adventure Activities Licensing Authority, who look at standards in these organisations, had given this body a clean bill of health and came and testified in court that the standard of instruction, the standard of leadership was extremely high here, and the freak and completely unpredicted weather conditions that had led to the rapidly rising water could not have been anticipated, and in fact it was a remarkable achievement of the instructors that they got all but one of the children out alive. Had that prosecution gone the other way, we would not only have lost that centre, but many, many others up and down the country would have decided they were no longer willing to take the risks of continuing. Yes, by all means. Of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend with whom I've often discussed these issues. Would he agree with me that that indicates the importance of ensuring that the Adventure Activities Licensing Authority remains in a condition where it is able to take that kind of stance?
My right honourable friend, who is an absolute expert on this matter, anticipates and did so much in this area in his time, not just with the NCS, but also more widely in the adventure training field in his time as a minister, anticipates my next sentence. That is why it is absolutely crucial, I would suggest to the House, that at a time when we're about to start a public consultation on the future of ALA, which will be conducted by a panel appointed by the HSE, not only that it survives, the Adventure Activity Licensing Authority survives, but that its brief is expanded so that it's able to ask why have these centres been closing over the last few years, and crucially, not just ask is the practice safe in these centres, but also what is the quality of the adventure that is being delivered there, because it's very easy to make so-called adventure training safe if it isn't adventurous. Need to be able to ask, what is the character-building quality of these activities? Now, I'm delighted to say that the HSE have taken the decision to include on the panel one outside member, Ian Lewis, the director of the Campaign for Adventure, one of whose patrons, I should mention, is another previous Prime Minister, Tony Blair. So I very much hope that when we have a National Citizen Service whose patrons are headed by one former Prime Minister and the Campaign for Adventure is is represented on the panel that's looking at the future of the Adventure Activities Licensing Authority, that panel will come up with a conclusion that will guarantee a future for ALA that ensures that it continues to be able to speak independently and expands its brief so that we discover why these centres are closing and that we get the focus back onto the kind of high-quality adventure which is so crucial to the future of the National Citizens Service. Thank you.
John Cruddas.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome this bill. Sure, it is a small bill,